Okay, so in this video I'm going to talk about the motherboard or um, the main board. So the motherboard is the central set of of connections that connect the whole of the computer together. There are various series of motherboards, and I spoke about that on the tab that you can look at the make and the model and the chipset. This is probably one of the ones that's going to take most of the research. You should think about the case and the peripherals video that went earlier, because a lot of this will depend on what you've got on your case. So if you've got, for example, USB 3 connections on your new case, then you'll want a USB 3 internal connector on your motherboard. You can see them on Amazon. You can see them on computer companies that sell computers. So Scan Computers, if you're in the northwest of England, is really great. And you just need to take your time. Look at the different types of motherboard. Look at the combination between the socket that you want and the chipset that is the most recent chipset, in my opinion. Although you might want to go back one chipset. So usually you'll see they're kind of a Z270, Z370. You pay a bit more the more recent the chipset is. The main criteria really is think about what socket you need for the CPU, the central processor unit that you want to fit. If you bought a modular power supply, as I covered in the first video, the peripherals and power supply video, then you'll be pretty flexible in terms of the fixings that you need on the motherboard. Pretty much all cases come with the standard power and light connectors for the motherboard. You'll want to think about how many, again going back to the peripherals video at the beginning, how many hard disks and DVDs and SATA SATA connections you've got. And if you look at the specifications, then you can just tick them off and make sure that whatever motherboard you're thinking of buying has the right connections for your needs. Most of them will have standard RAM sockets, and you will need to work out what kind of RAM that is. Most of the new motherboards will have DDR4 RAM. I think that's about it. So you need to really pay attention to the chipset, pay attention to the types of connections, so the SATA connections, or if you choose to have a more advanced storage system. I talked in the peripherals about the faster SSDs. Then you'll need an M2 or one of the later M2 slots on the motherboard. You'll need to think about what external or internal connections you've got, so where you're going to plug your case USB connections into. I think the motherboard is probably one of the most complicated new purchases, and I would say just take your time, look at the reviews, and pay attention to what people have found when they've used the motherboard. So the new motherboard has finally arrived. Make sure you take your time in your excitement getting out of the box. You'll want to make sure that you have got your CD with the drivers and what have you. We'll come back to that later. And the manual. Take time to look through the manual. Check that you know where each of the connections are on the motherboard, because that's going to come in really useful later when you start to connect them up. Swapping the motherboard out is like major heart surgery, really. It's one of the well, it is the biggest upgrade that you will do if you're putting it in a new case or you're putting it in the existing case. The principles are probably still the same. So for me, you want to strip out pretty much everything. So you want to take the side of the case, lay it in a flat area with plenty of light, plenty of space around for the bits you're going to remove. Start by taking out the graphics card, removing the other peripherals, taking out the retaining screws, ready to remove the old motherboard from the case. I would say if you're upgrading, you can leave the hard disks DVD in the case if you wish, and obviously if you've got an existing power unit, then you want to leave that in the case. Just move all the cables out of the way, remove the old motherboard. It'll come out probably with the CPU on it, and you need to look at the standoff screws. So the standoff screws are what the motherboard screws to, so you'll need to put follow the instructions, put the standoff screws, the little screws on which it sits, into the case. Then it's simply a matter of presenting the motherboard into the case. It only goes in one way around. You can see where the back panel is, and the back panel on the case will need to line up with that. You might just need to lift it up a little bit so that the back panel part goes in first, kind of goes in down first, and then just push it into the where the back panel lines up with the case. Allow it to settle down onto the holders, the standoff screws, and then you just need to screw it in with the screws that come with the motherboard. Don't screw it in too tight. It only needs to be hand tight, otherwise you'll end up cracking the motherboard, and if you crack the motherboard, then you'll end up with some serious issues in terms of short circuits and all sorts of weird and wonderful consequences. So you don't need to tighten it down too tight. So just simply put the back panel cover in, line up the motherboard with the back panel, drop it onto the retaining screws and screw it in. And then it's just a question of following the instructions. I make it sound easy, but there will be a large 24-pin connector, the biggest connector on your power unit, and that goes in the main connector on the motherboard. There'll also be an auxiliary and additional power connector, mainly to power the more powerful CPUs, and that could be 4, 6 or 8 pins depending how powerful the motherboard is and how new it is, and you'll see that that's usually at the top of the motherboard. So those two are the main power connectors to the motherboard. We talked in the previous video about setting in place the central processor unit and the cooling unit. So you can look at the previous video and see what you need to do that. I'll talk in a later video about RAM. You'll need to fit that into the RAM slots, and then the main thing really is to connect the motherboard to the switches and what have you on the front of your case. And you'll see it, they're usually a set of cables. They'll be the same set of cables pretty much for each motherboard. They'll be noted plus and minus, so there'll be pairs in most cases. So there'll be an HDD cable. Now that's the cable for the hard disk light, the little red light that flashes on the front of the computer. There'll be an on-off. It'll usually be called a power cable, again a plus and a minus. Some cases might have a reset switch, and it will have reset written on the cables. And if you look in the motherboard, there is one set of pins. Sometimes the motherboards come with a pre-arranged pin with labels on it. You can plug the cables into first and then just plug it in once. Otherwise you'll need to just find the pins on the motherboard and just plug them in. Make sure you get the plus and minus the right way around, but it's literally plugging them into the motherboard, and that will give the power switch, the reset switch, the HDD light, the information and the power that it needs to start and or show you what's happening with the computer. I think that's the most fiddly part, actually, of fitting the motherboard. We'll talk a bit later about the graphics card on a different video. And the only other connection really that you will see from your case, there'll be a set of connections usually at the bottom of the motherboard. So you'll see your case will have different pin connectors, little black connectors with holes for pins on the motherboard. So you're likely to have connectors for the USB. So you might have some connectors for the USB ports on the motherboard, and you'll see in the manual where those are. They're simply usually 8-pin slots. You just literally plug them in. You might have a connection for the audio on the front of the case, and again there will be an audio pin on the motherboard. You just need to plug that in. There may be a USB 3 connector on your motherboard. That is a slightly different pin. You'll see the little square modules are the ordinary USB, but the USB 3 is a longer pin set with more pinholes in it. And again, hopefully, if you bought a case with the USB 3 connector, you bought a motherboard with an onboard internal USB 3 plug. You just need to plug that in, find it where it is and plug it in. And then again, in the peripherals section, we talked about the types of hard disks and storage that you might have, and your motherboard will have a number of different connections, usually SATA now connections for your hard disks, and you simply need to plug those into your motherboard. And as I say, I spoke about the power module in the first video, the peripherals video, and that felt like quite complicated to me, and I was describing it. So let's recap. So you've got the motherboard, the back panel is fitted, the motherboard slides in to fit up with the back panel. The screws go into the retaining screws, and that's your motherboard fitted. Then you've got your power connections, and next we're going to deal with we dealt with the CPU in the previous in a previous video. We're going to deal with the memory in a later video, the graphics card in a later video. So you really need to be concentrating in this video and connecting the connections from your case to the various pins and connections on your motherboard. And the last thing you'll want to look at on your case is you'll have some fans, some cables from fans that cool the motherboard down, and there'll be fan connections dotted around the motherboard, pretty much all very clearly set out in the manual, and you simply need then to plug them in and just make sure that when you plug them in, that the wires that you've got are not kind of caught on any of the elements of the fan, so the fan can spin quite easily. Depends on how the cables are routed. Sometimes the cables can get in the way of the fans, so just make sure that you route them out of the way of the fans. I think that's pretty much it for the motherboard. That sounded quite complicated. It is probably the most complicated element of the upgrade. So you remember we put the CD aside earlier. The last thing to think about is the upgrade of the drivers. Install the LAN driver first, and then install the chipset drivers that allow the motherboard to communicate with the rest of the PC. And the only other thing you might need to add is just remember that if you've got a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth module, there might be an antenna in the box that you'll need to connect to the back of the motherboard for that to work. I was trying to troubleshoot my Bluetooth on the new motherboard and connected the antenna, so that is quite easily to do, and it's worth just making sure you read through, as I say, the manual once you've fitted everything, to make sure that you've covered all of the ground. Okay, so that's probably the most complicated element of the upgrade. I hope that was clear and I hope that was helpful. That's all I've got for you in this video, and feel free to leave comments, to subscribe, click the bell, and I'll catch you next time.